so I'm going to turn now and talk a little bit about the world economy. So if we go to the next slide, I don't have time to go through in a lot of detail these numbers, but generally we're expecting the global economy to be somewhere around about 3-ish for this year and something like 3 3/4 for next year. I think it's very mixed. It's like the Australian economy, depends which bit you're looking at. The US, I think, is sluggish. They're looking as if they're starting to pick up a bit. There still are issues about debt ceilings out there, and on the positive side, housing is starting to kick up. So the US you sort of think is going to grow around 2-ish. Europe, I think, is back in recession, and we don't expect it to sort of improve at all until the back end of this year. Japan is very disappointing, and you've just had a big fiscal firing up, and you've also getting printing of money for Japan. So they're going to grow a little bit, but pretty much a struggle. The emerging economies, it's mixed. China, which is really important for us, we think somewhere around about 7 3/4% growth this year. A little bit softer than what we were expecting recently. India is basically a bit of a struggle, but it still do something like 5, and non-Japan Asia is slow. The big difference between this year and last year is last year everyone assumed the world was going to blow up. Somehow the Europeans would blow the world up. This year I think basically nobody's assuming that anymore, and that's because of the actions of the central bank. And I think that's a lot of the reason for why equity markets in the last 6 months have improved. It is not because the world economy's got any better. We go to the next slide, which has got a lot of numbers in it, but basically what you see there across the top is our predictions in terms of total economies. So as I said, we're around 3, Treasury's a bit higher. We're again a little bit weaker than the Treasury for the globe economy, and we tend to be weaker in Asia than where they are. So again, that's probably one that you can just take away and think about. In terms of key themes in Australia, if we go to the next slide, my sort of summary would, and I'll take a little bit more detail in a minute, but basically I think domestic economy is very mixed, and I think the domestic economy's hit quite a soft patch. And even though the government doesn't tell you that, and it's a lot better than offshore, and that's certainly true, it's relatively soft. I think on the positive side, the equity markets are clearly helping wealth, and house prices are clearly improving. Multi-speed economy, talk a little bit about that at present, is getting worse. Despite what you might have heard in the last few days, I think the currency is going to stay pretty strong, which is going to cause lots of competitive issues. And we expect that the economy this year will be growing at something like 2.3%. So not great, and I think unemployment's going to go up a bit. And there's also this massive structural adjustment. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll just talk a little bit about the currency. I always say to people that if I knew exactly what was happening to the currency, I wouldn't be working. So, but what you can sort of do, what I've put up there is a model that's very similar to what the Reserve Bank's got. The red lines are saying where the currency should be. The currency, according to my models, say somewhere around 98 cents plus or minus 5. So that's the range it should be. So it's not radically overvalued, but there are clearly important competitiveness effects. Is it going to collapse? I think the only reason it collapses is if China collapses. Because throw away the econometrics, people in central banks all around the world see Australia as a play on China. They see it as a AAA economy, and they see it's got more interest rates than anyone else. Even if you sort of cut further, you're still getting paid a lot more than nothing, which is what you're getting in the other G3 economies. In terms of competitiveness, I'll just put up a chart. We go to the next one. This is sort of just an attempt to show you what's happened to Australian manufacturing competitiveness. And so on the left-hand side is the late 90s, and that's Australia versus a whole number of other economies. So we were sort of reasonably competitive, I suppose. So the green is Australia. And if you go to 2011, you basically see we've gone right up the scale. And particularly just about all of Europe is now more competitive than us. And so that does cause big pressure in terms of what it's actually going to do to the continuation of manufacturing, tourism, anything that's got tradable in it. In other words, you're trading with the international economy. Okay, so a little bit more in terms of where the economy is now and some of the big issues. So the next slide This is just a slide to sort of tell people that when we run our business survey, 1,400 firms each month, out we go. This is showing real G&E, or if you like, the domestic part of the economy against our business survey. The GDP numbers are basically the blue, and you can see they're really volatile. The red is ours. And what we're saying at present is, as we go forward, it's consistent with around 2%. So this is 20 years worth of history. And so that's why the central banks and markets look at the survey. If you go on to the next slide and we talk about business conditions, when you're around zero, that's like trend growth. And what this graph here is one that the Reserve Bank uses all the time. It shows the range of the industries that we cover, which are basically all of them except the public sector. And when you're up at plus 50, that's absolutely a boom. And so what you've seen in this graph is there has been a case recently where, you know, the strongest part of the economy was plus 25 and the weakest was minus 20. Now everything's starting to come down a bit. And so this is sort of saying, to some extent, the weak parts of the economy are basically still getting weaker, but the strongers are starting to also weaken as well. That's sort of that's sort of some time series, i.e. a bit of history. Where are we today? And the next slide sort of demonstrates it pretty dramatically. Red is confidence, blue is conditions. So first thing you say is the miners are not happy. And so they're down at sort of levels of confidence that we haven't seen for a long time. That was basically the same level as during the GFC. Their conditions are okay, but they're sort of slightly negative. They're no longer the big, strong driver. Now, this is mainly, it's not BHP and Rio. They're in our survey, but they get a weight of 1. So it's mainly sort of the second-tier miners and the mining services sector. Other parts of the economy that are doing better tend to be transportation, utilities. They're still pumping iron ore and coal out, and you still need to transport it, and utilities doing very well. Personal recreational services, that is the consumer spending in the service sector. Consumer, unlike Europe or the US, has money, has a job, and has money in the bank. And so if you need to go and see a doctor, you do. If you need to pay the school fees, you do, etc., etc. It's about a third of the economy. So this is the really positive part of the Australian economy. Then you get finance. Finance is basically fairly happy because the international market's settled down and the cost of borrowing is lower. But the actual activity levels are sort of average, and then you get the poor sectors. And some of these are really in recession levels. So wholesale, discretionary retail, manufacturing, and construction. So this is, again, a story that says it depends where you are, but there's some pretty bad numbers out there. Moving along to some of the more positive parts of the economy, so we go to the next slide. What it's basically showing is house prices are actually reacting to the cuts in rates. So on the left-hand side, I've got 2 charts. One is we interview 500 businesses who are involved in the property market each quarter, and what are they expecting to happen over the next 12 months? The answer is they're all expecting house prices to go up now. And underneath there we've got some forecasts. The right-hand side is just some modelling that we do against house prices. The models actually want house prices to go up about 10% this year. Our view would be that's probably not going to happen because unemployment's going to go up, and so we sort of have house prices going up 3 or 4%, but they are clearly have bottomed, and so that is quite positive in terms of wealth effects. So it might make, and the other thing, seeing we're in Victoria at present, Victoria is starting to turn too. Victoria has been a laggard state, and it's clearly proved a lot. The better markets at present are still Perth and Sydney. Okay, so the next slide, also what we're seeing is basically nominal retail sales starting to improve. The left-hand side is the official data, the trend numbers. It's been pretty volatile. It's had a very poor back end of last year, very strong early part of the year, and then it's sort of weakened away in March. All I'd say is it's improved. The right-hand side is basically just lining up data that we get through our credit cards and through our debit cards. Around about 20 billion a month gets spent in the consumer area, and 3 billion go through our systems. And so we line up, and what we're saying is that basically the data is suggesting things are easing off a bit at present. So much better retail sales, but I'm not sure I'd sort of uncork the champagne bottle just at present. The big issue as we go forward from an Australian point of view is mining. And if we go to the next slide, this will give you a feel for how big the mining investment is going on in Australia. Mining, remember, is about 8% of the economy. And on the left-hand side there, if you just look at the bars, it's saying in the next 12 months, they're going to spend somewhere around about $100 billion. So 8% of the economy spends $100 billion. 92% of the economy spends 60. So one of the big issues that you've got in this world is that you know that the mining investment, and if we go to the next slide, is peaking. So on the left-hand side there, mining investment's gone from 2% of GDP to 8% of GDP. So that's a massive increase. And so you get statistics like any dollar that's spent anywhere in the world on LNG, 70 cents of it is spent in Australia. So these are just massive numbers. But you're getting to a phase where, yes, there's a lot of activity, but it's not going to grow anymore. And there's a bit of a debate about how much it's going to slow and when. The blue line there is the Reserve Bank's estimate. The black line is we're a little bit more pessimistic. There are a few other issues that are important here. Number one is this is going to improve productivity. So you probably can bet on, in the next few years, hearing about the Australian productivity miracle. So a lot of the statistics about the productivity slowdown are basically because the statistician has been seeing huge increases in inputs in mining, but no increase in output. The other thing that's more important is that as you move from an investment phase to an export phase, you don't need as much labour. So 8 people to build an LNG platform, 1 person to run it. 4 people to build a new mine, 1 person to run it. And so that means that as this mining investment comes off, you really need non-mining investment to pick up. And for us, that is a real problem because we're not seeing any signs of it. So if I sort of sum up in terms of what that means for the economy, in terms of growth, if we go to the next slide, blue is domestic demand and red is basically GDP. And what people are now starting to acknowledge, the government's finally starting to acknowledge, is there has been a big slowdown in domestic demand already. GDP hasn't slowed as much because you're now moving into the export phase, and as you go forward, GDP will look fine. The problem is domestic demand will look really weak, and domestic demand is where you generate a lot of jobs. So if we just plug that into our forecasts for unemployment, which is the next slide, what you get is the blue line, which is high levels of unemployment. And so for us, that is why we would basically say we agree with the government in terms of GDP, but we think essentially unemployment is going to be higher. So my final slide is basically just a general forecasting slide. If you look through the various bits and pieces, frighteningly similar in terms of GDP. We're slightly weaker in the current environment. In other words, the 12-13 numbers, we're a bit weaker than the Treasury, but you wouldn't say there's a big difference. The really important difference is right on the bottom, which is nominal GDP, which is what I was mentioning before. So they're expecting 3.25, we're expecting 2. For next year, they're expecting 5, we're expecting 4 and a bit. That's worth about $10 billion to the budget. So that can cause lots of problems. So my overall summary of the budget would be it's very political. They've given away the idea of having to have a surplus straight away. It is not hurting the economy. There are issues about the forecasts and what it might mean, but I think the really important issues are more around what happens in 4 or 5 years' time when these big expenditure items kick in and we're not sure where the economy is going to be. So I shall stop there. Thank you.